My name's Nick Jones, Health and Safety Inspector based in Christchurch. And as Craig said, I'm here to talk to you about occupational health and construction assessments. So what is a workplace assessment? Essentially, an assessment is a discussion and a site walk. We will sample a process or an area of the workplace and we'll consider the hazards identified, the risks involved, and the controls implemented to manage those risks. We'll engage with the person apparently in charge, with the workers, with any health and safety reps. If the company employs a health and safety manager, we'll engage with them also. Often the assessment takes place with some or all of these people with us to facilitate a conversation. Each year, health and safety inspectors carry out 12,500 workplace assessments. So what are inspectors looking for? When visiting a workplace or carrying out an investigation, we will check whether the PCBU, the person conducting a business or undertaking, is thinking about eliminating a risk before minimising it. We'll check whether the PCBU is applying appropriate control measures. We'll check whether the measures the PCBU has in place are working as planned. We'll assess the PCBU's understanding and management of risks, including an understanding of the health and safety management systems. In deciding whether PCBU has controlled a risk so far as reasonably practicable, we'll compare the controls in place versus what legislation says, approved codes of practice, guidance, and standards. Airborne contaminants and noise. PCBUs have duties to ensure a safe work environment that is without risks to workers' health and safety. Clean air is a focus for WorkSafe, as Don has said, and inspectors will be looking for situations where there is a risk of exposure of contaminants or noise to workers or others. So what is a contaminant? Dusts and fibres, such as silica, wood dust, asbestos, arising from the grinding, cutting, ripping, or demolishing of materials. Noise from machinery, tools and vehicles. Chemical mists from spray paints. Vapours from solvents and fuels. Gases, such as carbon monoxide from plant and vehicles. Welding gases. Fumes from welding, brazing and oxycutting. So controlling airborne dusts, inspectors will be looking at how dust is managed on site. If inspectors observe workers exposed to plumes of silica dust, for example, you can expect that WorkSafe will stop and investigate this work. We'll want to see that you've identified the hazard and applied effective controls to manage the risk. Be prepared to explain to the inspector how it is that you've come to the control measures implemented. We'll want to see how these controls are monitored and reviewed to ensure their ongoing effectiveness. And if you're in doubt about effective controls, apply the hierarchy of control. If we can't eliminate, we must look at options to minimise. Look at options to substitute the material for one that generates a less hazardous dust, for example. Engineering or isolation controls, such as on-tool extraction systems, local exhaust ventilation systems, water suppression. Consider ways to separate people from areas where the dust may be generated. Administration controls such as safe systems of work, training in the use of the plant and information, inspections and monitoring. Our last line of defence, of course, is PPE. WorkSafe expects that workers are trained in the safe use and maintenance of their PPE, are fit tested for RPE, respiratory protective equipment, and have their lung function monitored, as Donna said, which includes a baseline and annual spirometry. And you can implement a combination of these controls to be effective. Inspectors will be assessing how you are managing noise on site. Again, be prepared to explain how you have arrived at certain controls. We'll want to see that you've applied the controls that are effective. We'll want to see how these controls are monitored and reviewed. Once again, following the hierarchy of control with noise, can you eliminate the source of noise? And often you can't. Can you substitute by using a different process or a different tool to achieve the same result? Can you isolate the noise at the source using an enclosure, use of a silencer, use of anti-vibration mountings on plant, for example? Separation of people from an area. Administrative controls, again like safe operating procedures, training in the use of the plant, and a buy-quiet policy. A buy-quiet policy and a risk assessment before purchase. It can save you a lot of trouble and money down the track. A maintenance regime for plant, because plant that is not maintained is often noisy. And monitoring regimes. Again, PPE is the last line of defence. Hearing protection alone is not enough. PPE should provide additional controls over what you have existing. WorkSafe expects that workers exposed to hazardous levels of noise have their health monitored, and this means a baseline and annual audiometry. Workers must be trained in the safe use and maintenance of their PPE. Chemical mists and vapour. If inspectors observe workers being exposed to hazardous substances like spray-on intumescent paint, for example, you can expect that we'll stop this work and investigate. The same applies if inspectors observe multiple open containers of solvents. Without controls in place to manage the risk of exposure, explosion or fire or spills, we will stop and investigate. Inspectors will be looking at how the PCBU is managing the risks. Chemical exposure, fire and explosion, as significant as they are often not as controlled as well as they should be. Critical for the management of chemicals is information. The SDS for the substance used must be consulted before work begins. Check that the SDS is a New Zealand SDS and that it is the latest revision. If it's not, request a new one from your supplier. Inspectors will check the SDS and the controls stipulated on the SDS against what we're seeing on site. Often I'll talk to a worker and ask their understanding of the SDS and its contents as well, to gauge an understanding. Once again, following the hierarchy of control, can you eliminate options to purchase pre-painted steel, for example? Can you look at substitute options by using a different chemical with a less hazardous characteristics, or substitute the process, say roll on the paint as opposed to spraying it? Can you use an isolation or an engineering control? Dangerous goods storeroom, flammable goods AS 1940 cabinet, establishing exclusion zones, exclusion zones around painting areas, and of course local exhaust ventilation systems. Administrative controls again, like your safe operating procedures, training and instruction, information like the SDS are important also. Lastly, the PPE. If relying on the PPE, again, WorkSafe expects that workers are trained in the safe use and maintenance of their PPE and are fit tested for the respiratory protection. A similar approach is taken with gas and fumes. If inspectors observe workers being exposed to hazardous levels of fumes, like welding fumes for example, you can expect that we will stop this work and investigate. Carry out a risk assessment and use the hierarchy of control. Can you eliminate generating the fumes? Consider using a bolt-up connection instead of a weld, for example. Can you substitute by using a different welding process with less hazardous characteristics? Can you use an isolation or an engineering control? Local exhaust ventilation and on-tool extraction, again, are good options for this. Administrative controls, like standard operating procedures, training and instruction, and the SDS. And lastly, the PPE. WorkSafe expects that workers are trained in the safe use and maintenance of their PPE. Respiratory protection that is not maintained or is not worn correctly, say for example over a beard, provides little protection. Don't forget that you should implement a combination of all these controls to truly be effective. We'll also want to see that the PCBU is engaging with its workers about risks and effective ways of controlling them. Not only is this a legal requirement, but it's a fantastic way to get the buy-in from the workers in relation to effective controls. Often the best solutions come from the ground. I'd like to encourage you all to visit the WorkSafe's website. There is a huge amount of information there, updated on a very regular basis. We've got guidance and tools, presentations, of course legislation and news. Ultimately, this is what all inspectors want to see at the end of the day, and I'm sure you do too. That's everyone who goes to work, comes home healthy and safe. Thank you.